say something first about Bible. Biblical text, our primary documents. More particularly, I want to talk about the Gospels this morning, those books that we have come to know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels, I'll refer to them as the Gospels, come out of a community, all right? So let's just look at how this happened historically for a moment. So Jesus, a Jewish rabbi teacher, has a 3-year ministry. He is killed, and in that time, he has developed his own circle of friends who, after his death, had to figure out what to do with him, what to do with his teachings. Those documents that we know as the gospel were not penned until at least 50 years after his death. So we have Mark at 50, Matthew, Luke about 80, and John 90. Some people think as many as 110 years later. So how did those texts and stories arise out of those periods? Well, they arose obviously within an oral tradition, but they arose out of different communities that then kind of started popping up around Judea. And those communities, over 40, 50, 60, 80, 90 years, had time then to think about, practice, recover, experiment with these teachings. And then, when they got to the point of saying, you know, I think that this way is now a way that can be manifested on paper, all right? So, the way came first. The earliest Christians were known as people of the way. And each particular text or story then arose out of the communal consciousness and experience. So, I'm going to read a very short biblical passage, and then I'm going to choose 4 windows to talk about. 4 windows that tell 4 stories. And Mariah, you just make yourself comfortable. The passage I'm going to read is actually the prologue of John's Gospel. It's very, very short, but I want us to think at this point about sacred intention. All right? I'm going to change a word within this passage. And then we'll do some thinking about how these stories reflect this sacred intention. In the beginning was the sacred intention. And the sacred intention was with the mystery we call God. And the sacred intention was the mystery we call God. The sacred intention was in the beginning, and all things came into being through that sacred intention. So these stories within the Judaic Christian tradition are meant to be a reflection, an invitation to consider the sacred intention. So let's start with the back window. On the right side, on your left, we have the story of the Good Samaritan. On your right, Jesus blesses the children. Over here, we have Jesus' story with the Samaritan woman, and when I'm ready to speak about the one at the back, I'll ask you to turn around. I think these windows are brilliant as we think about this particular day in history. Jesus is on the road teaching, and he is invited to share with people what is the most important commandment of God. And he says, well, if you're a good Jew, you know what that is. And the man who was a good Jew says, yes, love God, love my neighbor. And to which Jesus responds, good for you, that's it. And then you might remember that The lawyer who was wanting to engage him in theological discourse said, "But who is my neighbor?" And then you will recall that Jesus responded with the story of the Good Samaritan. So it's interesting to me that we have Samaritans in this room. We have the Good Samaritan up on the wall, and then we have the Samaritan woman here, because the Samaritans were in fact arch enemies of the Jewish people, even though the Samaritans themselves practiced a form of Judaism. And I won't go into the history, but they were kind of like the Hatfields and McCoys, all right? So different sectors out of the Judaic tradition who couldn't stand one another. And to the point where the Samaritans had actually created their own temple on another mountain, and the Jewish people destroyed it. And then the Samaritans would allow the Romans to occupy their territory for any raids that they wanted to make into the Jewish territory. So I think you see what I'm saying here. The lay of the land is really clear. They understood racial and creedal tension long before we ever did. And so Jesus tells this story of a man traveling on the road and being accosted by thieves and being left for dead. And a couple of holy men passed by, but because of their own religious traditions, weren't allowed to touch a body that was bleeding. And lo and behold, a Samaritan comes by, who is in fact the arch enemy of the man lying in the road. But the Samaritan picks him up and takes him to an innkeeper and pays the innkeeper everything he needs to look after the man. And you can only imagine in that context, when Jesus is telling that story, everybody probably is looking where? Where do you look when you're being informed in so many words that in fact the person that you think is kind of shameful and dirty and unrighteous and ungodly is in fact the one who is the mirror of the sacred intention? Where do you look? Up here, we have the story of Jesus blessing children, and that was always told in the context of the disciples rallying for power. Jesus, Jesus, when you bring in your kingdom, do I get to sit on the right hand and then my brother over here gets to sit on the left hand? And Jesus is just like, oh my goodness, like, you people, you aren't really getting this. Because there was a sense at the time that, particularly within the Roman Empire, where everybody was oppressed except for the top 0.001%, that if God were really God, wouldn't God just turn the whole thing upside down so that we could be the ones who were in charge? And what Jesus is suggesting is, you aren't hearing this. You aren't hearing me. Here's a model for healthy human community. Stop your jockeying. Stop trying to be number one. Stop thinking that there is a hierarchy here that is going to get you anywhere. And then he points to a group of children and suggests there's something about who these children are that you need to understand. And first and foremost, it was these children in this culture were worth nothing. They were totally outside of this hierarchy. So I think what Jesus is suggesting is, in order for us to have the kind of world that reflects the sacred intention, we have got to get out of our ego, out of our high horse, out of that place that understands that, where we understand ourselves as being better or less than someone else, and into a place where we know that we're simply in a place to receive grace and joy and love. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I won't go on. Woman at the well, another Samaritan woman. So, in order to get from the top part of Israel to the bottom part, you had to go through Samaria. A lot of people would take the long way around just to avoid those horrible Samaritans. But Jesus, at this point, was traveling with his disciples. Very, very hot day. It's noontime, and he decides he's going to go into the town, and he's going to find some refreshment. He meets a woman at the well. So many people make this passage about, oh, well, she's there at noon. She should have been there in the morning, but she's been divorced, so she doesn't really belong to the good group of people, so she's already a defiled woman, etc., etc. I'm not sure that's the point. The point is that in Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well, he breaks 4 cultural norms. First of all, in that world, not only were Samaritans and Jews considered to be completely divided, but men and women were as well. So first of all, he speaks to a woman in public, which would have been a no-no in his own tradition. Second of all, he approaches her from a place of humility, from a place of, you have something that I need. I think that's most interesting of all, particularly when we're looking at this whole global climate of what we need from one another as different faiths. And when we look at our own Christian tradition as a tradition that thought at one point it had all the answers, and it was our job to tell everybody else what they need. So Jesus comes to a woman from another race, a woman from an enemy race, and he wants a relationship with her. He knows she has something valuable to offer her, and then he drinks out of her bucket. Those who told that story, the community out of which that story arose, would have understood that this story was a radical invitation to a sacred intention of inclusion, interfaith relationship, and mutual interfaith, interracial support. So we have these three stories that tell our story about how we understand this sacred intention. Finally, we have the resurrection window at the back. You might want to turn and look at it. It's got the most spectacular images. Spectacular. So I'd like to suggest to you that we may not always have used that element of our story as best as we could. Keep in mind that the story of the resurrection is something that would have emerged from the communities. How are we going to explain this next era of Jesus' life among us? All right? So I'm going to just flat out suggest that the story of the resurrection within the Judaic Christian tradition, I think, is meant to be an initiation story. So, this is how that would work. We all come from our own separate stories where we think children are worthless, they should be seen and not heard. We have no time for Samaritans, and that woman is a sinner. Those are all stories that we have come from. And we have our own stories, don't we? Those stories we come from that tell us that someone else is not worthy, that we are better, that we have truth. We can go on and on. And I think what the resurrection story invites us to do is it invites us to cross the threshold into this new story. And this new story, as indicated by the stories illustrated in this window, is that we are one. We are one. And that oneness is at the heart of the sacred intention. So let me close with another little image from this video of this church in Memphis that embraced the community that moved in across the way. They started to do all kinds of things together. Well, first of all, of course, the Islamic Center, well, the building never got up on time, of course. So they needed a building to move into, and they needed a building to move into for Ramadan, which is the big Islamic festival. And it was just going to be for, just till our building's done. That ought to be about 10 days, right? But it's never just 10 days, is it? It's like 3 months. So for 3 months, this Islamic community worshipped and played and met within the Heart Song Church. And then the pastor and then the leader of the Islamic community started talking about all the ways they could start doing things together. And this is the one for me that is most profound. Every year, the month before 9/11, word goes out that a member of the Islamic community and the member of the Christian community are going to go together to give blood. There's something really profound about that, don't you think? Talk about living out of an incredibly sacred intention. So, if I were to give this message a title, and I rarely do, it would be, Why I Do Jesus. In this world where I have lots of friends and move through lots of worlds of yoga and New Age and Buddhism and etc., yet at the end of the day, I think I can have a foot in all of those communities, but at the end of the day, I am so strongly willing to claim the best that this tradition has to offer and to offer it to the larger conversation. Because these stories that are illustrated on our windows are the kinds of stories that are going to change the world, they're going to change us. So I invite you during this time of personal reflection to choose a window to consider. Are there some lines that you've drawn in yourself that are keeping you from understanding the other as neighbor? Are you still thinking that you have to earn your way through this life as opposed to be one who receives grace and love? Are you maybe needing to walk over a threshold to claim that larger, more gracious, more inclusive story?